Hello, and welcome back to Chatting with Chaz. I'm so glad you're here. Let me reintroduce myself for some of you that don't know me. My name is Chaz Easterly, and I am the creative director and founder of Linen and Flax Co., a lifestyle brand in Roswell, Georgia. If you haven't visited our stores in Roswell, you should, because they're super cute. They're both on Canton Street. We have an apparel store and a home store. We also have an e-commerce business. It's www.linenandflax.com. So you should check that out. And you can follow us on Instagram, of course. That's where a lot of us met, on Instagram. We kind of have parties and stories. And I wanted to take it beyond the party and the fun, which we love every day, hang out with us over there. But I wanted to go deeper in these podcasts, and I wanted to get to a different level. I wanted it to be in a more intimate atmosphere and kind of dig deep on a deeper level. I want to talk about topics that you can't really talk in a fragmented space like Instagram. And so that's what we've done. And last week you tuned in. So many of you. I was overwhelmed by the response. Thank you so much for tuning in. A lot of you were just shocked and amazed at the story that I shared. And it is an important story. It is the foundation of my story in my childhood and the challenges I faced and my family had during this time. So as I sorted through all of these challenges, and it has been over 30 years of dealing with it, I finally come to terms of sharing it and sharing it in my own words. This story has been shared in other people's words. It's been shared with sports writers. It's been shared through courts. And I have never really shared it personally. And I think that my hesitation was I didn't want to victimize my family, and I didn't want to victimize them again. And a lot of you probably can't see, but I was not only victimized, but my entire family was, and they were groomed and also abused. Now, not getting much more into that, that's something that I learned and discovered through lots of therapy and personally, understanding their backgrounds as well and how this could happen. It not only happened to my family, but you'll hear it happened to other families because this predator did the same thing again. And this is where we're going to pick it up. We're going to pick it up from the last episode. Now, if you didn't tune into the first episode, it is critical that you tune into it to make sure you understand this episode. And that is why I did this sequence, because I wanted you to understand the whole story of even how I got here today on this sofa. So where we left off last week is me and my dad headed to South Florida. We went to South Florida and we were starting kind of from scratch. And we had a little efficiency. He got an efficiency, and I was going to stay with him until my mom came back down to Fort Lauderdale. And while I was there, me and my dad went to the beach one day, and this gentleman approached me. Remember my last episode, I was talking to you about how I was really feeling like the smiling and looking pretty thing was working for me. And that's what I was doing. I was really leaning into that. So I knew how to do that. I'm at the beach. Gentleman approaches me, offers me a job. I smiled and looked pretty, and I said yes. I showed up to my new job at Hooters. Yes, yours truly. I was a Hooters girl. And when I first started working there, they put me in golf shorts and a golf shirt, and I was the hostess with the mostest, smiling and looking pretty every day, inviting people in to Hooters. And then shortly thereafter, I'm like, listen, I'll take the orange shorts because they were making a lot of money and I was making minimum wage. So I knew off the bat I was a businesswoman back then. And I took the orange shorts. They gave me the tank top, and then I started getting noticed. Now, I did not get noticed for my Hooters. I got noticed for my smile. They wanted to kind of recreate Hooters, wanted to recreate their brand and kind of be the girl next door. So they approached me and they wanted me to be their promo girl. So shortly after working there, I started doing all their calendars. I was on billboards on I-95, and I was the Hooters girl. I'm going on ski trips and different boat trips, smiling and waving and looking pretty with the big owl. That was me, the Hooters girl. Again, it's familiar to me, smiling and looking pretty. And one promotion I remember when I was smiling and looking pretty, it was a Dan Marino show, and he would host it in the Fort Lauderdale Hooters. And I was the girl that would stand next to him and represent Hooters as he talked about sports. And one evening, I had not told anybody about my bad relationship because that's all I knew it was at the time. One evening, the baseball player showed up, and he pulled me out of Hooters by the back of my tank top and said, "You're not a Hooters girl. You're my girlfriend, and we're going to get married." So he ended up coming back on the scene. And after a couple months of getting back re-engaged with him, some events happened where I ended up getting out. My family also, it was like, it was over. And I feel like that's not super important, but it is over. And there's a lot to tell you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but my parents, everybody in the family was like, this is not healthy. This is not good. So we all get out of it, never see him again, which that's kind of a miracle. He called a few times. We changed our phone number, but that was it. Never saw him again from that day on. Police were involved. It was a whole thing. It was like getting us out and it was good. So I'm at Hooters. Back at Hooters, because it's what I know, trying to make a living. We're all kind of getting back on our feet. And as I'm at Hooters, I am struggling with kind of some unanswered questions. Like, I'm struggling with a little anxiety. Now, no one talks about anxiety like they do today. So I just am restless. I'm not sleeping well. I'm having these thoughts like, what happens when you die? What was really happening in my heart at night when it was quiet and there was just silence? I was trying to unpack what had happened to me. I knew something traumatic had happened, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. None of us in our family talked about it. We just kind of got out of it, but no one really talked about it. And so I'm like, is it just a bad relationship? Like, why do I have this feeling of like, I'm damned and I'm going to go to hell? And I think a lot of it was I felt like I had these secrets that I hadn't told anybody, and that like I was a liar, I was a fraud. I don't know. I was just overwhelmed with it. And I had nowhere to put those feelings. I didn't know what to do with them. I wasn't telling anybody at my workplace at Hooters. I'm not in college. I didn't graduate from high school. This is what I'm doing. I'm working as a waitress. So one day, this guy comes in. And he starts having a conversation with me. And, I was a chatty Cathy even back then. I talked to all my customers. That's kind of what I was known for, as I would talk to anybody. And so he was talking to me and he started talking to me about faith. And he asked me, I had a cross that I just wore. I think I got it as an Easter gift. And he's like, do you know what happened on that cross? I'm like, no. And he just starts telling me that I need to find out what happened on that cross, and you shouldn't just wear a cross, but you should know what happens. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. And he gives me a card. Now, like I said in the first episode, I'd never gone to church, was not raised in a faith-based home. So this was like, no one invited me to church before. This was kind of a big deal. I'm like, well, thank you. I take the card. I never see that person again. But I kept the card. And a few weeks later, I decide I'm going to go to that church. I wake up my sister and my mom in the morning. And I say, hey, I'm going to go to church. Will you go with me? And they said they would. So we all drive to this church. It's 1994. I could be off in the dates. I think I'm like 20. And I walk into this warehouse. It doesn't look like a church. It looks like a warehouse. And when I open the doors, there's like 2,000 people in there. And there is something happening. There's like people, and then there's something happening. Like there's a connection that's being made, and I've never seen anything like it. And all I know is I need to know what's happening. I don't know anything other than that. Like, what is going on here? I take my seat. I'm watching people sing. Again, there's something going on. The pastor comes out. He says a prayer. And one thing that I struggled with in the middle of the night before I got to this church is I had this question that haunted me. And it was, what happens when you die? I could not settle it. I had this burning question, so much so that I went to a bookstore and I purchased a book that is literally called What Happens When You Die, because I thought my answers would be found there. They weren't. It just terrified me because it actually talks about your body shutting down and all these terrible things when you die. So I didn't find my answers there. I remember waking up my brother on occasion and being like, hey, I just can't sleep. Like, what happens when you die? And he didn't know. And so no one really knew. So the pastor comes up and he says a little prayer, and then he stands behind this pulpit and he says, do you ever lay in bed at night and wonder what happens when you die? He literally says the very question that I have been wondering about. It's been going through my head. I've been buying books. Here's my answer. I'm finally going to get it. I'm in this place. So he shares basically eternity. This is what happens. That there's hope of heaven. I'd never heard that before. There's hope for heaven for people like me. I was a girl that carried a lot of baggage. I didn't even know how much baggage I was carrying. Let me tell you, I had the backpack, I had the suitcases, I had a lot of baggage, but I hadn't yet opened the baggage. I just knew I had it. It was heavy and I was full of shame, full of secrets, and I had no one to tell. But that day I did. And I met Jesus that day. Literally at the end of this message that he was sharing about hope in heaven, he made an invitation, and it was an invitation of heaven and forgiveness and a place where I could take that shame and I could come to a cross and lay it there. And I did. That day I walked down that aisle alone. I stood at the steps and then I knelt and I prayed a prayer. And I asked God to forgive me. And I asked God to forgive me of my sins and all the sins of shame, I felt this weight of all of that abuse, but I carried it because that's what abused people do. They carry it, not the abuser, but you carry all of it. And especially when you don't know what it is, it's even heavier. And so I didn't know what it was. I just knew I couldn't carry it alone. And I found someone to walk with me. And so in June 1994, I want to say it was June 11th, 1994, my world was changed. I had a major impact and a major connection with God. And I was forgiven. And all I knew is that I was loved by the creator of the universe and that he had a plan for me. And so shortly thereafter, our family goes back to Connecticut for the summer. And we have to do that because we had a home there. And every summer we'd go back and fix up the home because my parents would rent it out. And then in September, we'd come back to Fort Lauderdale and we'd all go back to Fort Lauderdale. Well, I didn't really want to go back to Connecticut because I had just found something really amazing, like the key to my life. But I figured I would find it in Connecticut. There's got to be churches there. So I go back to Connecticut. I get a job as a bartender. One of the jobs was a hostess because they wanted someone to stand at the door and smile and look pretty and draw people into the nightclub. That was me. And then as I'm working as the hostess, then the the owner of the bar says, I want you to be a bartender. And there I am. I don't even drink. I'm underage and I'm a bartender because I was smiling and looking pretty. It's what I did. It's what I knew. Still not really understanding the value in self-worth. Still not really understanding what really happened to me. Just smiling and looking pretty. Nobody knows. It's still a secret. So while I'm there, I start dating the owner of the bar. Old patterns. He just was really taken by me, and I developed this relationship with him. Never kissed him, never did anything physical, just saying that because there was a lot of shame there. So I didn't want to do that. But I did go back into a brief relationship for a couple months, and quickly he wants to get married. And that kind of freaks me out. And he proposes to me and I say yes. And then I'm like, no, now I'm in this relationship with God and I feel like I don't want to get married, but I just did that because I'm a pleaser. That was a pattern. And I didn't realize that, but that will be a pattern that continued to follow me until I got healthy. So I said yes. And then a week later I called him. I was like, I can't marry you. It's off. I'm sorry. You're a great guy. He ended up becoming a Christian and now he's a pastor. So that's an amazing thing. But he was not my husband. But I realized I had patterns. I dated another professional athlete when I went back to Florida. I realized that was a pattern. I didn't stay in that relationship long, but it's definitely like I was not healthy and whole yet. That is the moral of the story. There are patterns of being a pleaser and also dating something familiar, like an athlete or, someone that I just smiled and looked pretty with. Now I decide I'm not dating. I am discovering who this Jesus is because I believe that getting back to Fort Lauderdale is critical to that church. I knew that my summer was fine being a bartender and, doing all the things to make a living, but I needed to get back to that church, not in a relationship with a guy, but back to a relationship with Jesus. So in the meantime, I will say though, when I was in Connecticut, I did visit several churches and I could not find what I was looking for. I knew that the key was back in Fort Lauderdale. So that is really the reason I ended up back in Fort Lauderdale, to get back to that church. When I went back to that church, I enrolled in Bible college. Now, funny story is I didn't have a high school diploma. Remember, I told you that last week. I also carry a lot of shame because of that. But I enrolled in Bible college, and I just figured I was going to go as long until I got busted. So I enrolled. They kept asking me for my transcripts, and I'm like, okay, I'll get them to you. Yeah, totally lying in Bible college. But I was just admitting the truth. It's just a little white lie. Again, I'm still in the process, right? So I wasn't perfect, but they continued to be persistent. And one day they said, listen, we need your transcripts. It's college. And I started crying. I said, I don't have any transcripts. I didn't graduate from high school. Basically, I'm a loser. No, I'm kidding. I was a mess because I didn't have it, but I knew that's where I needed to be. And they said, that's okay. You can be here. You're not going to get credit for it, but you can continue to be here and learn and grow in your faith. And that is where I needed to be. It was basically like a hospital for me. It's like I was being healed through that Bible college. I was learning about who I was because I was seeing myself in his eyes, not in the eyes of men, that I didn't have a diploma, that I wasn't good enough. I will tell you another pattern that carried me, continued to keep me off track, was I didn't think I was good enough. I was always trying to prove my worth and my value instead of just living in it. And so I didn't think I was good enough. So this Jesus was showing me that I was good enough. And so as I learned more about him, I was becoming more whole. And I knew that was critical. That's all I knew. So now I'm still working at Hooters, but I realize, it's time to move forward. I start not only being in Bible college, but I make the move to go into ministry. When I was at Hooters, I found myself naturally ministering to the girls that were there. And I felt like I was being called into ministry, and I wanted to minister to women. So I start working at the church. I'm basically folding church bulletins at this time. I don't have a big role there. But I would do whatever I could because I wanted to serve God. And I was on fire. My passion was God. My passion was people. My passion was ministry. It still is to this day. I just get to do ministry in my way, which is through this amazing platform. One of these platforms, so many. So anyway, when I was a senior, remember the last episode I told you there was senior skip day and there was like a Yankee pastor that was there? Well, isn't it interesting that very Yankee pastor was the pastor of the church that I ended up in? And what's interesting is I never told anybody the story yet. I hadn't shared this information. I'm working there now. I'm at the Bible college. I've been serving there for a couple of years. And one day the senior pastor comes up to me and he says, hey, I need to ask you a question. Were you engaged to so-and-so from the New York Yankees? I'm like, yes. How do you know? Because I never told anybody. I didn't want anyone to like me because of that, because that's kind of how it was. I just wanted to create my own story, my own life. And I kind of was separating myself from it. So he goes, I remember you. You know why? Because I was the Yankee pastor. And I remember being in the dugout and people were talking about you. And I had asked, well, how did he meet her? And the joke was that he met you at Toys R Us because you were so young. And instead of laughing, as a pastor, my heart broke. And I went back to my seat after he was the Yankees chaplain pastor. And I went back to my seat in the stands and I told my wife about you. And then we saw you because he would come into the stands to talk to me. And when we saw you, we saw how young you were, and we prayed for your salvation that day in the stands. We prayed for you for weeks after. We thought about you often. And isn't it amazing? After all the churches that I could have ended up in, that a guy comes into Hooters with a card, a guy I never saw ever again, invites me to that church. That's the church I end up in. That's the church I end up in Bible college. That is the church that begins this faith journey that really changes everything. And that is the church that changed my life. So I thought that was incredible. I ended up meeting my children's father at this church. It seems like it's the right thing because, hey, we met at church. That's an upgrade. And, he's a Christian. I'm a Christian. We have similar beliefs. It all seems good. I will tell you, I started diving into the past relationship. And I wanted to be healthy for this marriage. I really wanted to do it right. I really wanted it to be my happy ever after. And so I wanted to go into it as healthy as possible. So I did some work and I started meeting with a counselor at our church. And that was the first time as I shared my story that I started realizing that it was more than just a dysfunctional relationship like I had made it sound. I would tell, when I would tell the story of my last boyfriend, it was just dysfunctional. He was a control freak. But as I talked more, she was like, you were abused and you were groomed. And that is more than an unhealthy relationship or dysfunctional relationship. That was abuse. I'd never really heard that word before. So I started kind of diving into that. I started unpacking a little bit about some of the feelings I felt towards my parents as well and my mom. And I felt like I was doing a good job and I was putting the work in. I will find out later that I had really only scratched the surface. I ended up getting married, and I think because I wasn't wholly healthy, I missed a lot of red flags. And we'll get into that later. But I did miss some red flags because I was repeating some patterns of being with someone that is into control and that someone that I wasn't enough for. And I learned very quickly into this marriage that I wasn't enough really in any department. So I was on the constant pursuit of then being enough. And that's exhausting. And so that's what I was doing. I have these 3 amazing kids. And Riley, Jacqueline, and Christian are born. They are filling my soul. They are filling my calling. I knew that I was born to be a mother. I still know that is my number one role. I don't even look at it as a job. It is a privilege. And so I get to be their mother. Riley's born, my oldest. He's amazing. He is the love of my life. And then my daughter comes. And then I'm like, wow, if just after you have your first kid, you're like, you can love another one more. And then you love them as much. And when she was born, something really amazing happened that I didn't expect. When she was born and I held that beautiful little newborn baby and I held her against my cheek, they wrapped her up, they put her against my cheek, and I held her against my cheek. And she was warm, and she was rosy and pink, and this little blonde peach fuzz on her head. And I just started weeping. And it was uncontrollable. And it was just, I couldn't stop. Now, I'd had a child before Riley was born. That did not happen. Love Riley. But something happened when she was born. And I think what happened was another layer. When I held her, there was this overwhelming sense of, I am going to love her and protect her fiercely. No one will hurt her. Now, I know that's impossible, but if I have anything to do with it, no one is going to hurt this little girl. I will protect her. I will be fiercely, crazy, protective, and I'm going to shield her and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she is whole. There was a part of me that wanted to heal my relationship with my mom through her because I felt I wasn't protected. And so there was this overwhelming feeling of this little girl that I had to fix it, and I had to fix it with her. So we'll talk more about that. When Christian was born, again, you don't think you could love anymore. And then he's born. I mean, I had found so much, love in these 3 children. And I think that they healed me in another layer, and they healed me and they made me the mom that I never dreamed I could be. I feel like through some of the trials I faced and challenges, just like any of us, because I think we all go through stuff with our families, we learn to be better. And I feel like I looked at my past as an opportunity to be the best mother I could be, and to be very present and to be vigilant and to be fiercely protective and all those things. So I did just that. Now let's fast forward. I'm being a mom. I'm married. There are some challenges. All's good, right? I'm smiling and looking pretty among all the challenges in my marriage. Nobody knows. Maybe a handful of my friends, my sister. But I'm smiling and looking pretty on Facebook. Everything's good. And the phone rings one day. And I answer the phone. And it's a deep voice. And it's a prosecutor. And he's got a case. And I think he was a DA, if I'm correct. It's not the actual prosecutor that ended up doing this trial, but the first call, it was this DA. He was getting evidence and collecting evidence. And he tells me that this baseball player was arrested for the rape of a 12-year-old girl. The rape of a 12-year-old girl. He was also arrested for the abuse of a 14-year-old girl and a 15-year-old girl. And I believe one was 17. And there were a lot of allegations. But the problem was there was no proof. They didn't have pictures. They didn't have anything to really give them proof other than the girl's word, which should be enough, but it isn't. So he asked me to talk with him and give him information. And he asked me to come to Texas to testify on their behalf, not on my behalf. This would not be my trial, but this would be a trial for them, for a 12-year-old girl that was raped, a 14-year-old girl, a 15-year-old girl, a 7. There was a list. I hung up the phone. And I was advised not to do this. Why bring this up? It's been, how many years? It's been 20 years, I believe. I could be wrong. It's been a long time. It's 2008. My abuse happened in 1989. You do the math. Let it go. It's over. You're good. You're married. You've got kids. Let it go. But I can't let it go because I feel like I did let it go. And if I hadn't let it go, these girls would have never been victimized. A 12-year-old girl would not have been raped. Had I said something, had I not kept it a secret, had I not called the police, I didn't even know what it was. If I'd understood what had happened, maybe he would have been in jail. Maybe he wouldn't have been a basketball coach for young girls. There was no Google. I didn't know what he was doing. There was no way of tracking him. I had a lot of regret, and I had a lot of remorse, and I had a lot of responsibility, I felt, to go and to speak on their behalf. Remember, I was in ministry. I was ministering to women. When women would come to our church that were abused, I would be the person that would minister to them. I wanted to minister to them. I wanted to talk to them. I wanted to talk to them about the shame that they carry because I understood it. I wanted to talk to these girls, and I wanted to defend these girls. So, although I was advised not to go, really from everyone, my best girlfriend, Janet, flew to Atlanta. She picked me up and she drove me across the country because I didn't fly. I had this wicked fear of flying. Listen, I was a broken girl. I had a lot of fears that were irrational. I was dealing with anxiety. I didn't know what it was from, but I feel like a lot of it was tied to my brokenness and the fact that I had not dealt with this issue yet. I didn't have any closure. It was just this pocket of, I have no idea what happened, but there's trauma and I didn't know what to do with it. I remember thinking one day I wanted to run into this guy because as I was trying to peel back the layers, I would have a realization that, oh, I was abused. I remember this counselor told me that. And, oh, yeah, that's really weird. That shouldn't have happened. Oh, when I was watching this show, To Catch a Predator, I'm like, he's being arrested because she was 15 and he was 22. Well, that sounds like me. There's a reason he was arrested. It's all these things, but no one talked about it. So I didn't really dive into it. So anyway, I show up. I go to Texas. I walk into this room, and the lawyer, Kim, wants to meet me. This is before the trial, day before the trial. She calls me into her office. Nobody is there. And I think it's a Sunday. The trial would start on a Monday. And it's quiet. And she says, I'd like to talk to you. She pulls me into a room. And she's like, I wasn't sure. She starts asking me questions just to get the story. And after she asks all the questions, she goes, I have to tell you, I was really nervous about meeting you. All of us were. We didn't know what we were going to get because we talked to you on the phone and you just seemed like you were fine. You got it all together. And it just seemed crazy that you would be okay because what you went through was something that most people that we see on this side are not okay. They either go down the path of drugs or alcohol or more sexual abuse. And they don't look like you. They don't act like you. And honestly, after talking to you, we would have thought you would have been crazy. And we're just so happy that you're okay. And she goes, and I said, well, I am. And it's the grace of God. And I dove into my faith. And that's all I knew, that there was a hole and I didn't know how to fill it. And there was a gap and there was a lot of shame, but I didn't know how to unpack it. But I found my peace and my healing and forgiveness in my faith in Jesus. And she's like, I'm not a believer, but what you're saying, it could only be God because of who you are. Till this day, she says that we talk often. So she's the prosecutor. And she says, listen, we're going to bring you in for the sentencing phase of the trial. These girls were young and they were abused. And I don't know if you fully understand that you were too. He victimized you. He raped you and he abused you, sexually abused you. So I had never heard those words. That was the first. I remember leaving that room thinking, can you say that again, Kim? She's like, I go, so he did do that to me? She's like, yes, he did. I had never understood it. And that was the beginning of diving into that. I still, to this day, it's wild to me, as wild as it is to you. A lot of you were shocked. But I just didn't understand. And that is something that you will have to just trust, that when you're in the midst of it and someone grooms you, and he was a professional at it, and he did it again. He moved into people's homes. He said the same thing to their families. Their parents let him in. He was a manipulator. He was really crafty, and he was really good. And he victimized me, and he victimized my family. And you're just going to have to leave it at that. So the trial starts. I'm in a room for a few days with these victims. And while we're in this room, as they go testify and tell their story, I'm sitting with them for days and I'm learning about them, and they're telling me their story, and we are bonding through trauma. We're bonding through abuse. They're wonderful girls. They're smart girls. They're beautiful girls. It's funny. We all kind of looked alike. He had a pattern. And he did the same antics. Like I said, he moved into their homes. The parents liked him. You can't make it up, but he did it. I think he realized it worked, and he followed that pattern. So we got close in a very short time, because trauma bonds you, right? Abuse, unfortunately, does as well. As we got to know each other and hearing their stories, I was older then. It's kind of like the mom in the room. And I had this ministry happening. So I was talking to them, and I wanted them to know that there was hope and there was healing that they could get as well. They were doing the work, and this was their step of the work, facing their predator. It was my step as well. We were all stepping into this together. Young girls, different ages, because they waited as well. They were a little bit older. I was older. This is the first opportunity we were going to have to stand and face the predator. The pedophile, another word I had never heard of. So they took the stand. I'm now called to the stand. Before I took the stand, I prayed, and I asked God to give me words, to give me courage, to give me confidence to face him. I wanted to be able to look at him and be direct. I wanted to be able to share all the things that I had in my heart, but share in a concise, profound way. I didn't want confusion. I wanted clarity. And I prayed those prayers. When I walked into that courtroom, it was said, and the prosecutor, not my attorney, she was not there for me. She was defending these young girls. But the prosecutor told me, he's not worried about you. He even said, don't worry about her. Because the last time he saw me, I was a young, meek girl with no voice, no confidence, didn't know my value, didn't know my worth. I said yes to everything he told me to do. So that's what he expected to show up in the courtroom. But what he didn't expect is someone that was healing. He didn't expect someone who had an encounter with God, who had strength, who was becoming whole, who was becoming resilient, who was understanding what had happened, and who was taking a stand. So I got on that stand. My words were clear. My thoughts were precise. And I stood, well, I sat, but I faced the man that abused me for 3 years. And I looked him in the eye. And I'd always prayed for this opportunity, like to run into him at an airport. And I didn't fly. So that's funny. I had fears. Remember, I was telling you I had all these weird fears. And I think it was all because of this anxiety and this, I just kind of was a mess. So I had said, God, I'd love to run into him in an airport. And I just want to tell him that I know what he did to me and I know what he did. And that's all. I just want to tell him that. But God is bigger, and he just gives you better platforms and better stories. He gave me a stand where he was silenced and forced to be silent. He could not speak. He could not defend. He could not manipulate me. He had to sit there and he had to take it. And so as they tried to drill me and accuse me and make me, and all of the girls, victims again, or victimize us, I sat there and I faced him, and I faced my giant. And I told them that wasn't true. And they said, but he loved you. No, that's not what love doesn't abuse you. And I used words that were honest and that were truthful. And I was able to look at him in the eye, and I did. And I said, I know what you did to me. I understand what you did to me, and I understand what you did to them. And I said things that I never dreamed I even had in my vocabulary, but it was precise, and it was God. And it was God meeting me in that room so that I could have closure and so that those girls could have closure. And I will tell you, at the end of it, he was sentenced for 45 years. And he is not known for a legacy. He is not known as a great baseball player. He is not going to be known for his RBIs and, his home runs. He is known, and his legacy will be that of a sexual predator, a pedophile, and an abuser, a man who raped a 12-year-old. He needed to be put behind the bars. He probably would have only gotten 5 years, but the sentencing trial, after they heard the victims, after they heard the stories, they said he can't get out because he won't be stopped. So he got 45 years in prison. After the trial, the jury wanted to speak to me, and they wanted to say that, yes, we heard about how he victimized these other girls, but we want you to know that we put him behind bars because of what he did to you as well. This was not your trial, but we heard, and he needed to be punished for that. So there was redemption and there was closure for me. Part of the fact that I just felt like he got away with it as I had learned and discovered, and I knew more. But he didn't, because God saw me, and he saw that I needed justice. He saw that those girls needed justice. And on our behalf, he protected us, and we got the closure we needed. So I leave Dallas. I have closure. I remember leaving and driving back home, and there was a lift in my spirit. There was a weight lifted off of me. And I felt like it was black and white my whole life, and all of a sudden I could see in color. It was crystal clear. There was a focus that I never had. It's like I knew what had happened. I remember, my dad had called me in the car, and he just was broken and crying. He said, I'm so sorry. And there was conversations of healing. And I realized that I needed to go through more work, and I needed to dive into more healing. And I remember there were issues in my marriage, and I just wanted to be better on all fronts, and I wanted to be healthy, and I wanted to be whole. And there was a passion to be healthy and whole. And so I remember we had gone to a lot of marriage counseling. Nothing was really working. I decided I'm going to go to a one-on-one counseling, and it was going to be in depth. And I just thought it was me. I always thought I was the problem. That was kind of a pattern I had. I wasn't enough. If I could just be better on all fronts, I'd make everybody happy. I was a people pleaser. I wanted to please my parents. I wanted to please these men in my life. And I wasn't pleasing myself. I wasn't taking care of myself. It was all about others. And if I could just be better, I'll make everybody happy. That was a pattern. On my pursuit of being better and being enough, I start this counseling, and it's in depth. It's every Monday for like 6 months. It's 3 hours. I would leave these meetings, and it would be like I had to take a nap. I was exhausted. I was completely emptied out. But the first session I went to, and I said, listen, I'm here. It's like you have to process a person. I thought I was going to be processing my kid's father at the time, but it was really about my mom shortly. And when I got into this counseling, and I started diving into my relationship with my mom, because it was complicated. There was conflict. When she'd come visit, it would just be hard. And I felt like I didn't have patience with her, and I didn't have grace, and I just was on edge. There was like an edge, and I realized I was bitter, and I was mad, and I just couldn't get past those feelings. It was like angst in my spirit, and I didn't have that in any other areas. I mean, there was a little bit in my marriage. There was like a burden, but with my mom, it was just like, I got to deal with that. And I really felt like it was time. And so what I realized is the bitterness and angst and anger I was carrying was not really affecting my mom. I would try to communicate what was going on, but she wasn't understanding. And one thing I learned through this and through the journey of 30 years of trying to understand it all is that it really becomes about you. At the end of the day, it's how you handle what's happened to you. And I knew that if she could not see everything the way I wanted her to see, the way I believed she needed to act, the response that I felt like I deserved, I had to let it go. And I needed to go and I needed to lay it down somewhere. And I needed to hand the burden over to God. And I needed to find forgiveness for my mom. And I needed to be okay with what I could get from that relationship. And I just need to leave it at that. And I knew the work I had to put in was forgiveness. And I had to kind of look at her story as well. And that's the stuff that not everyone knows. So there could be so many questions. But my mom had a traumatic life as well. And there are reasons that people fall into patterns, just like I was falling into the same patterns. And I wanted to have grace for her, like God had grace for me. And I feel like if we give other people grace, it really sets us free. And I learned how to do that. I learned how to see her differently, how to see my circumstance differently. And I learned how to forgive. And I learned after that in-depth counseling that I put in the work, and it was a lot. I mean, there were whiteboards, there was writing it all down, there was journaling, there was the last day, I remember they put a bag of bricks basically on my back, and it was in a backpack. And I remember taking that backpack off and just saying, I'm going to lay it down here once and for all. And instead, I'm going to fill it with forgiveness and for love and for grace. And that changed me. And it changed the dynamic with my mother. And I'm so glad that I put in that work, because my mom has passed away. It's been about a year. But I was able to, although complicated, challenging, I was able to deal with our relationship in a respectful way. I was able to love my mom. And I'm so glad that I could do that and have peace in that and not have angst when she's in the grave. And that truly set me free. And that was a major layer and part of my healing and restoration was dealing with that relationship and ultimately having a loving relationship. She's also my my children's grandparents. And they had a beautiful relationship with my kids, my mom and my dad, and they still do. And they are amazing in my kids' life. And that was something that I didn't want my kids to see me behaving in a way. Here I'm telling them about the love of God and forgiveness, but I'm not going to forgive. I'm going to treat their grandparents a certain way. So it was important to me as a role model for my kids, even as a Christian, to kind of live out my faith. And we can say and call ourselves a Christian, but if you're not living it, you're not living it. And I needed to live it. And that's living it, putting your faith into action and doing the hard things. And that was one of the hard things, is forgiveness. So it ended up being the best thing I could have ever done. And again, did a lot of healing and restoration in my family. Now, I'm seeing in color. The black and white, I've handled forgiveness. I've faced my giant. I spoke up for the first time. I'm learning I have a voice. I'm learning that I can see clearly. I'm learning that I'm not as broken as I think I am. And when a broken person who has patterns that misses red flags, and I've gone into a relationship now where I'm still, I was a broken person going into that relationship. When you start healing, you become a different person. And that's causing some strain in this marriage, because a healed person looks a lot different. And a healed person starts having a voice. And a healed person starts finding her worth and her value. And once that's found, everything changes. And so an entrepreneur is born. Honestly, I didn't have room for creativity, honestly, because I was dealing with all this baggage in my head and I had to get rid of it. Once I was able to kind of unload all of that, I could see not only in color, but I had creativity, I had ideas, I had thoughts, I had visions, I was journaling. I mean, I was on fire. And that's where I'm going to end this episode. I'm going to tell you in our next episode how God started showing me who I was. I started uncovering and unboxing my self-worth. I started seeing my value. I started seeing gifts and talents I never knew I had. I started thinking I was smart. I started thinking I might be a businesswoman. I started thinking I might be able to do that. I think I can do this. You know what? I can do this. And I could do hard things because I did hard things. And that is where my journey starts as an entrepreneur and as a woman that is healed and a new version of myself that I never anticipated or thought would be. And I'm going to tell you more about her in our next episode. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for hearing some hard things. And I hope that this can touch you and inspire you. I hope that maybe you'll find healing through these words. I want to encourage you to follow us, of course, on Instagram at Linen and Flax Co. Also Chatting with Chaz. We'll be there daily, but also keep tuning in. There's lots of stories, not just from me, but I'm going to bring in guests. I'm going to bring in people that maybe you've heard in these past couple of episodes. But there's going to be a lot unfolding. There's going to be a lot of joy. There's going to be a lot of happiness. There's going to be a lot of growing and learning. Also, subscribe to our channel. If you're following on YouTube, we really want to grow this channel because as we see that you're watching, we're going to produce for you. So make sure you subscribe and follow on all the channels and all the things. I look forward to talking to you again next week to part 3, the next chapter. An entrepreneur is born and a brand is born. And that is a great story. I'll talk to you next week.